Certainly appreciate everyone being here this morning, sincerely. And, I think there's something that I need to deal with real quick. And I don't say this in a mean way, but I think everyone needs to be informed. And so if you ever have a question about me or my situation, come to me and ask me, So, because I have an open book. I don't hide anything. But I want to make some things clear this morning that may not be as clear as everyone thinks it is. And so, why does the government give ministers special tax treatment? Because we're in tax time right now, right? Why does that take place? But before I can answer that question, we have to look at why churches are tax exempt and why the government doesn't entangle themselves within the church. Why they don't get caught up in religious issues. If churches were taxed like a business, the government would have to audit them, regulate them, define what counts as a religious organization, decide which expenses are legitimate, enforce payroll rules, demand annual tax returns, examine contributions, review spending, and potentially penalize churches. And so that would be a direct control over religious things. And we know that our government doesn't do that, right? The government has said we will not tax churches because taxing them would require us to regulate them. It's the same idea behind taxing ministers. It's the same purpose. Ministers are tax exempt on support that they receive from their housing. It's a housing expense. This began all the way back in 1913, when the government first decided to tax the people. In 1913, churches were already supporting ministers. They were providing homes for them to stay in. And so, if churches had to pay taxes, can you imagine paying income taxes on contributions? Paying property taxes on the building and the property, paying taxes on tax investment. As it is, churches do not have to file any forms with the IRS. Churches do not have to inform the IRS of any money that they have coming in or out. And so, let's look at it from a minister's standpoint. The special treatment that takes place. It all began, like I mentioned, when the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913. Later on, Congress, not only did they allow ministers to have a housing expense, but they allowed congregations who didn't have a parsonage to pay a minister cash money for housing. And it's tax-free. It's not taxed. Oregon, and most states are the same way. When I file my taxes, the IRS gives me my adjusted gross income, my AGI. Oregon takes my AGI, what the federal government has said my adjusted gross income is, minus my housing, and said this is my income. Oregon's gone above that and said for the first $50,000 above that, ministers don't have to pay tax on that. That's not me. That's what Oregon says. I didn't make that law. And think about this. Open your Bibles and turn to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. Because here's where the idea comes from. Philippians 4 and verse 15. Paul says, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning," what is it? "Giving and receiving, but you only." It's a gift. It's giving and receiving. Paul was giving gifts. Now, why aren't gifts counted? Because gifts aren't wages. Gifts are not earned income. So that's why it's called support. That's why other congregations can support a minister and it's not taxed, because it's not for employment. It's not for what I do. But I want you to think of the value of a minister and what he has in a community. What does the minister tell the congregants of a congregation? To go out to the bar and have a good time? To get into brawls? To get into domestic disputes? No, but he tells people to turn the other cheek. Do good unto your neighbor. To help out others. To spiritually guide people. It's a good thing to have a minister of a congregation, and our government realizes that. They see it doesn't cost them anything but some tax. That's it. That's it. Most ministers don't do it for the glory and the praise of individual people, but they do it to please God. Most preachers don't get enough support. And that's why many leave. And so I just wanted to get this out there on the table. If you have a question about anything that I receive, ask me. Let's not talk about it. Just come to me. And then I can answer any question you have. But I can't answer them when they're talked about, and I don't know what's being talked about. And so we're going to look at Paul this morning. You know, did Paul take money from the church of Corinth? And we kind of went over this Wednesday night a little bit. But he didn't, and he didn't do so for a certain reason. There was a specific reason. You know, some congregations will take advantage of the preacher. That's exactly what Corinth was doing. They were taking advantage of Paul. Paul loved them, and he taught them, and he corrected them, and he suffered for them. But they refused to support him. And even finally, Paul addresses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And he has to tell them. He uses Peter and the other apostles, and he also mentions the brothers of Jesus as proof that those people were being supported. And today we'll look at what Paul said, why Corinth acted the way they did, and what it teaches the church today. And the point is that Paul says others were supported, but he wasn't. He and Barnabas were not. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, if you have 1 Corinthians chapter 9, look there. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 4 through 6. And we'll look at that. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 4 through 6. He says, "Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife? As do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas," or Peter. Peter took his wife with him as he traveled on missionary journeys. And he was supported. Paul says in verse 6, "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working?" Paul and Barnabas had to work. And yet, the indication here was that the church at Corinth was helping Peter and his wife in some sort of fashion. They were also helping other apostles. And they were helping the brothers of Jesus. James and Jude are two that we know, because they wrote letters in the New Testament. That's how we know these things. And so he's saying, do we not have the right to take food? To take support? Yeah, they did have the right. And he shows them. And so Peter was supported. Peter's wife traveled with him. They were provided for. And the other apostles were supported. And the brothers of Jesus were supported. And Corinth supported them. Because why else would Paul use them as an example if they weren't helping them? And so Paul's question, it's harsh. I mean, it probably made the Corinthians, if they had any feelings, it wouldn't have made it feel very good. But Paul needed to do this. He didn't take their support. And it appears they weren't freely offering it. And yet they supported them and didn't help Paul or Barnabas. And so Paul's not guessing about this. He's exposing the fact that the Corinthians already knew they should have been helping him, and they weren't. And Paul points out, he shows support is a God-given right. That's what he explains to them. Paul gives 6 proofs that preachers have the right to receive support. He says a soldier is paid, right? A soldier is paid. Verse 7, who serves as a soldier at his own expense. We don't expect our military members to provide for themselves, right? To go fight a war. No. He says a farmer eats from his own field. Who plants a vineyard or who grows a garden doesn't eat of his own fruits and vegetables? Who tends a flock and doesn't drink the milk of the flock? And then he mentions the law of Moses, commands it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox which treads out the grain. And so he also goes on to say, number 6, that temple priests live from offerings. That God made it so they took care of them. And he says there in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 13, those who serve at the altar partake in the offerings of the altar. They were to eat part of the sacrifice. That was for them. And then he says, verse 6, the Lord himself commanded it. In verse 14 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. And so he makes this conclusion because of the issues that were going on. And he had the right to force Corinth to support him. But he chose not to do that because of their attitude. Because he was afraid of what they were going to say if he did take support. And he didn't want that. He wanted a congregation to realize once they gave themselves to the Lord, then when they gave support to him, they were helping in him preaching the gospel. Doing it publicly. That was, even though they had to have jobs and couldn't do what Paul was doing, they were still doing the work through him. Corinth was proud, and they were judgmental. They said Paul's bodily presence is weak. Speech is contemptible. 2 Corinthians 10:10. They looked down on him. And that wasn't right. Corinth preferred, super apostles. Guys who could really preach. Guys who tickled the ears, made them feel good. He says, I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. They admired the flashy, impressive, polished apostles. That's who they liked. Corinth was using money as control. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 7 through 9. Look at what he says there in 2 Corinthians, because he really gets on to them for having this attitude that they had in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 7 through 9. He said, did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? He says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. Remember what we read earlier in Philippians? No one else helped him. Men came from Macedonia and they helped him at Corinth. And verse 9, and when I was present with you in need, I was a burden to no one, for what I lacked the brethren who came from Macedonia and supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being a burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. He's not gonna take money from them until they give it joyfully. Why would they? You know, that's like some of them saying, did you see that sack of money those men brought Paul? Man, he gets to travel the country and do all kinds of fun things. He gets beat in prison. Man, I wish I could be beat in prison. Right? No. But Paul's not taking their money because of that attitude. He didn't want them to have that attitude. You know, thinking about, maybe you think, you know, we can cause other people to sin, right? Our actions, by things that we do, we might be able to cause someone else to commit sin. Paul didn't want to do that to them. He didn't want to force that on them. He didn't want them to do it and then regret it. To have an uncheerful heart in giving. He didn't want that. So he refrained from taking money from them. Those brothers who came from Macedonia took care of his needs, supplied his needs. Corinth gave nothing. Other churches supported Paul while he worked with Corinth. But Corinth did support others for whatever reason that might have been. And this is the part that many miss. You know, Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 9, 4 through 6 only makes sense. You know, Paul knew Peter was being supported. And along with Peter, his wife. Isn't that an interesting thought? I know some places that will pay for you, but not your wife. Peter's wife is going on. Okay, Corinth knew the other apostles were being supported. Corinth knew that the brothers of Jesus, those who doubted him while he was alive on the earth, even kind of mocking him, now they're being supported. And they could care less about helping Paul. You know, probably the man who deserved it the most. You know, otherwise Paul's comparison here would be meaningless if all of that wasn't taking place. And he's saying, you support them, why not me? And so Paul refused their support to protect the gospel, to protect them. And he explains, he refused Corinth's money. He refused it to avoid being accused. He says, we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel. So Paul endured doing without to prevent the gospel from being hindered. Paul also said in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 12, he says, but what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. And so he refused this support here, so that manipulators of that congregation could not claim that Paul was preaching for money, that Paul depends on us. Paul works for us. We employ Paul. Paul could see that's what they wanted to do. And to show the difference between him and false teachers. Verse 20, look at 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 20. He says, "For you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you in the face." And yet Paul took nothing. And those false teachers that were there took everything. They took what they could get. And so, what does this teach the church today? Several things. Be careful. Be careful. A preacher has a God-given right to receive support. Support is not a favor being done. Support is not charity. Support is a right given to a preacher by God. That's it. I don't make the rules. A church can be wrong in how it treats a preacher. Corinth was. Supporting others while refusing her own preacher, Paul exposed it. You know, a preacher may refuse support to protect the gospel. Paul did. A church must not use money to control the preacher, right? Corinth tried to do that. You know, there's a reason why the government doesn't tax churches. Because it expects the church to use the money to take care of its ministry. And everything it's included. They don't expect the church to put money in the savings account to grow money. That's against the law. But they expect it to be used. And Paul was doing these things at Corinth to make them see. His message to the Corinthian church was a message that is still valid today. You know? Support the preacher. Honor the work. Don't use money as a leverage. Don't admire the flashy preacher, good word-speaking guy who knows fancy words. They supported Peter and the apostles and the Lord's brothers, but not Paul and Barnabas. What a horrible thought. You know? Two men that really deserved support. Paul exposed it. God's recorded it for us. And we get this great lesson. You know? And so I'm here today to tell you that I'm not in this job for money, nor wealth or fame, or because I get to stand up here and look like the greatest member of the church. It's not why I do it. I do it because I get fulfillment. When people see the truth and they turn, man, there's nothing more exciting in the whole world than sitting down and studying with someone one-on-one. Or teaching the gospel to a class when people who want to learn. It's encouraging. It's always been encouraging to me. And that's why I'm here. You know, I've been asked, why are you there? Because I see potential. I do. You know, the South is really strong. And a lot of times the West Coast gets blamed for weakness. So I thought I could help in that way. And so if you're here this morning, you've never obeyed the gospel, not a better time to do it. I mean, there's no greater satisfaction than knowing that you're right with God. By believing in God, by trusting in His Son and having faith in Him that He gave His life for you, that you might have all your sins washed away, to repent of those sins, to be immersed in water, confessing His name, and then being added to the Lamb's Book of Life, that when we die, we don't have a worry at all, that we'll wind up in heaven when we die, and we close our eyes and wake, and the angels are taking us. away as the Bible records. And so if you've done that, but maybe have wandered away from the truth and want to be restored this morning, whatever your need may be, please come all together. The rest of us stand and sing a song of encouragement.
There's a fountain free